You're listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.
Hi, it's Louisa Tanner Munson, and I'd like to welcome you to Saturn Through the Houses, which is part of the Saturn series. As you may know, I'm studying and talking about the influences of Saturn this month, June 2018, on Patreon. And this is a look at Saturn according to Saturn's position in our birth charts. So, for instance, in this episode, the first episode, I'm going to look at how it might affect the personality if you were born with Saturn in the first house. And then towards the end of the recording, I'm going to look at what might be happening to you if Saturn is transiting through the first house. So there's two different looks at Saturn in the first house from the birth perspective and through the current and transiting perspective. So hopefully it will be very useful. So the first thing we need to really consider is, what does Saturn rule and what kind of effect does Saturn have? Well, Saturn, principally, as you may have heard in some of my other talks about Saturn, Saturn is the father, the great father, and often represents our father in our birth charts, or the patriarchy, or the most dominant parent, our stricter parent, or the parent that's most outward facing or most professional. So on one level, Saturn represents our feelings to our most strong parent, as evidenced by the kinds of relationships that Saturn has in our charts. So, for instance, if you're looking at your birth chart right now and you notice that Saturn's in the first house, in fact, it doesn't matter which house it's in for this example, but if you're looking at Saturn, you might want to see what kind of relationships or aspects it has to different planets within your chart. Where Saturn has lots of positive links, i.e. conjunctions are quite useful and often beneficial, trines and sextiles. The trines and sextiles show up in usually as a blue colour, linking Saturn with other planets. Then your relationships with your dad and authority in general seems to be quite harmonious. Where Saturn has difficult relationships with other planets, for instance in squares, i.e. with a 90-degree angle, or in oppositions with a 180-degree angle, often represented by a red line in astrology programs, then you have more of a challenge with your feelings towards the patriarchy, towards authority figures, and towards being your own authority. So Saturn in itself really represents our ability to take authority and be authoritative and to push ourselves forward in life. Saturn is about structures. It's about building frameworks that can house our personality and allow our personality to flourish. Now, sometimes these structures and frameworks are really useful, as evidenced by people who seem to have really easy Saturn aspects, and they can be quite useful and freeing, so the structure provides something useful that we can grow our personality from. And sometimes it can be a bit difficult. It can be quite limiting, that we feel imposed upon, as represented by lots of difficult connections with different planets within our birth chart. But a lot of it also depends on the position of Saturn in the birth chart. And for those people who've got Saturn in the first house, it's quite a strong position to have it in, really. The first house represents our overall personality and appearance, how we like to come across, or how we do come across. It really represents our body. And the first thoughts that people might have upon meeting us, like our first impressions. So Saturn is quite a sobering energy. Like I said, it's quite fatherly, quite serious, quite structural, It's quite law-abiding. It creates its own rules. It is its own authority. So people with a strong Saturn, i.e. Saturn in the first house, will tend to come across as quite serious. When you first meet them, they'll seem quite thoughtful and in charge of their own lives. It might be that they're slightly lonely because Saturn sometimes likes to keep himself at a slight distance, in the way that lots of bosses do. If you think of boss, or an authority figure, or the traditional father in a family, those kinds of roles are slightly distinct and slightly outward facing, and there is a little bit of space between a boss and his employees usually. And that space allows reflection to take place and allows there to be some comfort, so that when you do have to pull rank on people, you can do it without hurting friendship. So lots of people with strong Saturns are usually very aware of keeping a bit of space between themselves and other people, so that, if ever there are boundaries that appear to have been broached, it's very easy just to cut off from people and to not be influenced or impacted by their perceived bad behaviour. People with a strong first house Saturn can seem a bit judgmental because they have quite strong barriers, as just described, and that can sometimes be necessary. So what you might find is that someone with a first house Saturn either keeps themselves to themselves and creates strong barriers, so that people can't reach them, or that they might have physical barriers or barriers to communication that keep them slightly apart from people or slightly aloof. So on the whole, Saturn's quite a guiding force for people who are quite serious and methodical and logical. These people with first house Saturn will prefer to refer to science, or refer to studies, or refer to normality or routine and structure as a first port of call, as opposed to their own instincts. So they're able to defer their own instincts to a higher authority. So you might also see a strong first house Saturn in the charts of someone who's deeply religious, who may be religious because they were born into a religion, or because they found religion and they found the authority that they're happy to listen to and defer to, which can make them consider serious life changes and keep them apart from people. So it's a very strong position to have. You might expect to see a strong Saturn in people who become CEOs, or who run their own businesses and who take charge of things. So, it's not necessarily the profile you'd see of a teacher necessarily, even though they do take charge of groups of people and have to be on the ball. But you might expect it from maybe the headmaster of a school, so really, really being paternal and taking on that responsibility. So strong first house Saturns tend to look for responsibility and assume responsibility. Even if it's not asked for, they'll often be the ones that will naturally take charge in a situation, and naturally be cautious. You might also see somebody who, talking about caution, who will be very good at contingency planning. So, for instance, if there are a group of you and you're trying to organise a day out or a holiday or anything, in fact, it's the person with the first house Saturn that will be relied upon more heavily than the others, and they will be the people that want to make the arrangements because it feels safer in their hands, and they trust themselves so much more than they trust other people. So you might find that. Now, according to your personality, that may sound like a thoroughly decent individual, or it might sound like a really boring position. It doesn't really matter. I mean, we've all got the archetype of decency and boredom, i.e. represented by Saturn, represented in all of our charts, someplace, somewhere. It's just a bit more obvious with people with a first house Saturn. That said, they're also one of the lucky people, you know, with the first house Saturn, who are much more likely to find success and work towards it. So these guys are a lot more methodical, and if they have a goal that they want to achieve, they will unashamedly and quite rightly, they will set themselves goals to achieve and doggedly go through them one by one. So this is somebody that you can really trust and rely upon. You know, it's a very, very useful energy to have within your chart and be able to access it quite easily. Now, if I'm going to talk about Saturn from the perspective of it transiting into your first house, then that's a different story. Because I guess what's happening is your life is taking on a bit more of a serious overtone. Immediately before it goes into your first house, it's crossing your ascendant, and the ascendant is the most important part of the chart, I think. It represents the start of your story. I mean, obviously every part of your chart is important and as it goes, but the ascendant really does mark the very first instinct and our first breath on the planet. And so as Saturn crosses over the ascendant is really how we are perceived in the world and our effectiveness in the world at a very base level. As Saturn goes over it, it tends to have a very dulling and dampening effect on our personalities. Immediately before it does that, it will have been transiting through the 12th house of our secrets and our pain, our hidden pain, and the things we're quite unconscious about. So that's usually a time of where we're quite pulled back from who we are. You know, when Saturn goes through our 12th house, which I will come to in subsequent recordings, we tend to go through a very introverted period where we want to lick our wounds and really take our time to work things out and understand what's going on in our lives. When it crosses the ascendant, it's like we're ready to restructure who we are, and we're ready to create stronger structures, and we're also very conscious of aging. As Saturn crosses the ascendant, we tend to age quite considerably, quite quickly and quite surprisingly, and we might feel a bit old and a bit creaky and feel that our internal structures aren't really holding out in exactly the same way as we'd hoped. So it's quite a sobering and calcifying effect initially. So when Saturn goes through the first house, it can appear to be quite a depressing time when we're faced with our aging bodies or illnesses within our bodies, and where we actually take a spotlight to those parts of our bodies and our life that aren't working very well, and we start shining the light on it and thinking, okay, that structure's not very good and that's not really fit for purpose, and we start changing things. So it's not unheard of to hear people go on diets or diet regimes or exercise regimes, anything to strengthen the body. And it's definitely not unheard of to hear of people retraining in something as Saturn goes over the ascendant in the first house, because these people are creating a stronger internal structure for themselves in a career way or in a life skills way. So it's about improvement, and it's about goal setting and taking things step by step. So it's not a glamorous or fun time at all. It's not a time you'll look back on and go, gee, that was my most exuberant and spontaneous moment in my life. That was really fun. I want to do that again. However, it would be a time that we look back on and say, wow, that was quite defining. That choice that I made to strengthen this, that and the other, strengthen the weaknesses, was good. Obviously, we're not all under the demand or dictate that we have to improve and change our lives in any way, shape or form. So that's how it expresses itself in people that are really happy to change and work with the energy. When people don't work with Saturn energy, out of all of the planets, the Saturn energy is the one that you really want to work with the most, because where you don't work with it, then the Saturn energy comes to you. So where you aren't taking authority in your own life and working at creating better structures so that you are more respected, or that you speak more sense, that things are working in an orderly fashion, when you don't take care of that yourself in your own life, then Saturn tends to teach you a lesson. And the lessons in the first house are quite harsh because it affects your body. So, you might be feeling old and creaky as Saturn goes into your first house. And if you don't take steps to make changes in your life as Saturn goes through your first house, then authority figures might come in to your life to force that to happen. So how can that happen? How can that manifest? Well, it can manifest with you getting chronic illness. You get the signs as Saturn's going in the first house. You get the signs that something's not quite right and you don't work at it. You'll end up under the care and authority of a doctor or the medics or whoever. Or if you don't take the time and care to get your structures right, you might end up not paying a tax bill or not getting all the legislative things in a row in your life and get caught out by authority and get made an example of. So getting Saturn energy working right when it's going through your first house is actually quite important, because where you don't, you tend to get tripped up and as with all Saturn lessons, they're very harsh as they land and as you have to deal with it. So it normally ends up with a lot of humble pie. The thing worth remembering with transiting Saturn going through the first house is its next stop is your second house, which is to do with values and a little bit to do with your career and your day-to-day work, but your earning potential. So as Saturn's going through your first house, it's prudent, again another Saturn type word, to get the ducks in a row to do with your bank and your car and your insurances and things like that, if they are important to you, and your health, etc. So that as Saturn goes into your second house of work and earning potential, that you have all the right energy to improve upon your earning potential. Because if you don't do that, then your whole Saturn in the second house will be a fight about keeping your earnings going well. So Saturn is always on the move, and is always transiting through our house. Granted, it's a very slow transit. Saturn spends 2.5 years approximately in each house or in each sign, and it takes about 29.5 years, give or take, for Saturn to go from one place and end up in the same place. So the Saturn cycle is very long and slow, but it's worth getting right. And when it goes into the first house, and crosses the ascendant first of all, and then properly into the first house, then it really marks a transition moment in your life where you've got a chance to get things right from the start. So hopefully that's been helpful. If there's anything you'd like to talk about, feel free to drop me a line. Louisa@feelgoodastrology.com or just check out my website or contact me through Patreon, whatever works best for you. But if there's anything you'd like to talk about, then feel free to make contact. Take care.
You've been listening to Feel Good Astrology with Louisa Tanner Munson, and this recording has been made possible by all you lovely supporters at Patreon. To request a personal reading with Louisa, go to www.feelgoodastrology.com.